The day a 16-year-old girl handed me a notebook and made every person in my courtroom go completely silent. In 40 years on this bench in Louisville, Kentucky, I have learned not to make assumptions about what a case will be before it begins. A file is just paper. The person standing behind it is always something more. But I want to tell you about a Wednesday morning in March when a 16-year-old girl walked into my courtroom, set a spiral notebook on the table in front of her, and quietly asked if she could speak. What she said in the next 8 minutes did something I did not think was still possible after 4 decades of this work. It left me without a single word to say. And in 40 years, that has never happened. Not once. If you believe that young people can still restore our faith in what's coming next, subscribe right now, because this story is proof that they can. It was a Wednesday in March, one of those early spring mornings where the sky can't quite decide what it wants to be. Gray in the east, pale blue pushing through in the west. The courthouse felt like the season, caught between something ending and something not yet started. My clerk, a woman named Doris, who has been with me for 16 years and who I trust more than I trust most of the attorneys who appear before me, handed me the morning docket at 8 o'clock. She set it on my desk. She took one step toward the door. Then she turned back. She said, "Judge, the Whitfield case, the minor. I think you'll want to read the full notes before you call it." Doris does not say that. In 16 years, she has never said that. I read the full notes. Then I sat for a moment with my hands flat on my desk. Then I walked out to the bench. The case read simply, Respondent, Jade Whitfield, 16. Charge, driving without a valid license, failure to obey posted signage. Accompanying adult, guardian, Ruth Whitfield, 61, maternal grandmother. I had handled cases involving minors many times. They require particular care. A courtroom is a formal and intimidating place for anyone. For a young person, it can be the kind of experience that defines how they see authority for the rest of their lives. I have always believed that my responsibility in those moments goes beyond the charge in front of me. I called the case. The door opened. Ruth Whitfield came in first. She was a small woman, perhaps 5'2", with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She walked slowly, but steadily, with the particular uprightness of someone who was taught that posture was a form of respect and has never forgotten the lesson. She wore a church dress, navy blue, her Sunday best on a Wednesday morning. Behind her came Jade. Jade Whitfield was tall for 16, lean. She wore a white blouse tucked into dark slacks, and her hair was pulled back neatly. She walked with her grandmother without touching her, but they were close. That particular closeness of two people who have learned to read each other's pace without discussion. She carried a spiral notebook against her chest with both arms. Not a phone, not a bag, a notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $2. She held it the way you hold something you intend to use. I noted that. They reached the respondent's table. Ruth Whitfield sat. Jade sat beside her, set the notebook on the table, and folded her hands on top of it. She looked at me directly, not nervously, not defiantly, with the particular steady attention of a young person who has come prepared. I said, "Good morning, Ms. Whitfield, Jade. You're here on 2 charges, driving without a valid license and failure to obey a posted sign. Is that correct?" She said, "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct." Her voice was clear, composed, but underneath the composure, there was something careful. The way a voice is careful when the person behind it is holding something larger than the question being asked. "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor, on both counts." I looked at her grandmother. Ruth Whitfield was looking at her granddaughter with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone watching another person do something hard and being quietly, fiercely proud. I said, "Jade, before I look at the circumstances, I need to understand one thing clearly. You are 16 years old. You do not yet have a license. "What were you doing behind the wheel of a vehicle?" She looked at me steadily. She said, "I was taking my grandmother to dialysis, Your Honor." The room was quiet. I said, "Tell me what happened." She opened the notebook, not to read from it. She set it open beside her, like a reference, a record she had prepared. Then she looked at me, and she spoke from memory. She said her grandmother had end-stage kidney disease. She had been on dialysis 3 times a week for 14 months. The clinic was 4 miles from their home on Barrett Avenue. She said her grandmother's regular driver, arranged through the clinic, had called that morning at 6:15 to say he could not come. Car trouble. She said her grandmother had no other family in Louisville. Jade's mother, Ruth's daughter, had passed away 2 years prior. Jade had lived with her grandmother since then. She said she had called 3 neighbors. 2 did not answer. 1 could not leave work. She said she had looked up ride-share options. Their account was suspended because of an unpaid balance from the previous month, a month when the water heater had broken and taken the household's extra money with it. She said she had looked at the bus route. The nearest stop was a 40-minute walk from the clinic. Her grandmother could not walk 40 minutes. She said dialysis cannot be skipped. She knew this because she had sat in that clinic enough times to know what happens to patients who miss sessions. She said, "So I drove her." She said it plainly, not defiantly, not proudly, the way you state a fact you have made peace with. "The sign I failed to obey," she continued, "was a no left turn sign on Morrison Avenue. I didn't see it in time. An officer pulled me over at the next block." She paused. "I told him immediately that I didn't have a license. I didn't try to pretend otherwise." I looked at her. I said, "Was your grandmother treated that day?" Jade said, "Yes, Your Honor. The officer was," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "kind. He allowed me to call the clinic coordinator, who sent someone to bring my grandmother the remaining 2 blocks. My grandmother made her appointment." I said, "And you?" "I waited on Morrison Avenue for 2 hours until my grandmother was done and the coordinator brought her back to the car. Then the officer followed us home." I sat with that for a moment. A 16-year-old girl pulled over without a license, waiting on a Louisville street for 2 hours so she could drive her grandmother safely home. My clerk, Doris, at the side of the room, was looking at a fixed point on the wall with tremendous concentration. I said, "Jade, what's in the notebook?" This was the turning point. And I want you to stay with me here, because what she said next is the reason I am still thinking about this case. She said, "Your Honor, I did something wrong. I know that. I don't have a license and I drove anyway. I want to be responsible for that." She put her hand flat on the notebook. But I also wanted to be prepared to explain myself properly, so I wrote everything down. "What exactly did you write?" "Every alternative I considered before I made the decision to drive. Every phone call I made that morning. The bus routes I looked at and why they wouldn't work in time. The ride-share situation. The neighbors." She paused. "I wrote it all down because I didn't want to stand in front of you and just say I had no choice. I wanted to show you that I actually looked for other choices first, that I thought about it." I looked at her. I looked at this 16-year-old girl who, before appearing in my courtroom, had sat down and documented her decision-making process so that a judge could evaluate it fairly. I said, "May I see it?" She looked slightly surprised. Then she nodded and passed the notebook to my bailiff, a man named Curtis who has been in this courtroom for 11 years and who I have never once seen lose his composure. Curtis carried the notebook to the bench. His face, as he handed it to me, was completely neutral, in the way faces are neutral when their owner is working very hard. I looked at the notebook. She had written in columns, time on the left, action on the right. 6:15 a.m., driver canceled. 6:17, called neighbor Mrs. Patterson, no answer. 6:19, called neighbor Mr. Dorsey, cannot leave work. 6:22, checked rideshare, account suspended, balance owed $34. 6:25, checked bus route 23, stops at Baxter and Oak, 43-minute walk to clinic, grandmother unable. 6:31, called clinic coordinator, no driver available before 9 a.m., appointment at 8:15. 6:34, drove. Beneath the timeline, she had written one paragraph. I am going to read it to you the way I read it that morning, carefully, because every word of it matters. She had written, I know that driving without a license is against the law, and that the law exists for good reasons. I am not a safe or experienced driver. Something could have gone wrong. I thought about that, but I also thought about what happens to a dialysis patient who misses a session, because I looked that up a long time ago when my grandmother first got sick, because I wanted to understand what we were dealing with. I made the best decision I could with what I had. I am prepared to accept the consequences of it. I just wanted the court to know it was a decision, not an accident. I chose this, and I would choose it again. I set the notebook down. I pressed my lips together. I looked at the ceiling of my courtroom, which I have looked at many times in 40 years, when I needed a moment that was mine alone. I heard from the gallery behind Jade a sound, very soft, the sound a room makes when something true has just been spoken. I looked at Ruth Whitfield. I said, Mrs. Whitfield, did you know Jade was going to do this before she started the car? Ruth Whitfield smoothed the front of her dress. She said, in a voice that was quiet and precise, No, Your Honor. I told her to call the coordinator and tell them I couldn't come. I told her we'd figure it out. She paused. She said, Grandma, just get your coat. The sound from the gallery was slightly less soft this time. I said, How long has Jade been your primary caregiver? Ruth said, Since her mother passed. 2 years and 3 months. She folded her hands in her lap. She does the shopping. She manages my medications. She sits with me during sessions when she isn't in school. Her voice did not waver, but it slowed the way voices slow when they are carrying more than they are saying. She is 16 years old, and she has never once complained. Not once. I looked at Jade. Jade was looking at the table. For the first time since she had walked into my courtroom, she was not meeting my eyes. She was somewhere private. I understood. There are things that are hard to hear said about yourself out loud, even when they are good things, especially when they are good things. Because good things said in public about sacrifice you have been carrying quietly have a way of making the weight of it suddenly real. I gave her a moment. Then I said, Jade. She looked up. I have some questions about your situation, and I want to be direct with you. Do you want to be a driver? Is that something you have pursued officially? She straightened slightly. Yes, Your Honor. I have my learner's permit. I got it 4 months ago. I have driven with my school's driver's education program. My instructor says I am. She paused. The ghost of something almost like a smile, quickly controlled. He says I am a careful and capable driver. And your grandmother, does she have any other regular transportation arrangements beyond the clinic driver? Jade said, We're on the waiting list for a volunteer driver program through the church on Breckenridge. We have been for 7 months. I nodded slowly. I made my decision. I said, Jade, I'm going to speak to you honestly, and I want you to hear every word. She was watching me completely. What you did on the morning in question was against the law. Driving without a valid license is not a technicality. It is a safety issue. For you, for your grandmother, for every other person on Morrison Avenue that morning. I want you to understand that I am not minimizing it. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I also want you to understand something else. I have been doing this for 40 years. I have had adults stand in the exact spot where you are sitting who could not tell me with any clarity why they made the decisions they made, who had no record of their thinking, who expected me to accept their account without documentation or detail. I tapped the notebook gently. You prepared a timeline. You documented your alternatives. You wrote a paragraph that acknowledged the risk you took accepted responsibility for your choice, and was honest enough to say you would choose it again. You did not come in here and tell me you had no choice. You told me you had choices, and you made one. I paused. That kind of thinking, that kind of honesty, I do not see it every day. Not from adults, not from anyone. Jade was very still. Here is what I am going to do. The charges stand on the record because they must. That is how this works, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I am waiving all associated fines, completely. I heard Ruth Whitfield exhale, one quiet breath. Additionally, I said, I am going to make a call today to the volunteer driver program at Breckenridge Street Church. I have a relationship with their coordinator. 7 months is too long to wait. We are going to fix that. Jade blinked. Your Honor, let me finish. I leaned forward slightly. I am also going to say something that has nothing to do with this case and everything to do with you. I paused. You are taking care of your grandmother the way a grown woman would, the way many grown women would not. And you are doing it while going to school, while getting your learner's permit, while building a future for yourself that does not stop because things are hard. That is not ordinary. Do not let anyone tell you it is ordinary. Something gave way in her face. Not collapse, not tears, something quieter. The particular release of a young person who has been carrying adult weight and has just been told by someone with authority that the weight was seen. She said, very softly, "Thank you, Your Honor." I said, "Thank you, Jade, for the notebook, for the honesty, for getting your grandmother her coat." From the gallery, the sound was no longer soft. The call to the church coordinator took 4 minutes. Doris made it while I was still on the bench finishing the morning docket. She came back during a recess and told me the Whitfields would have a volunteer driver within the week, a retired teacher named Frank who drove 3 other dialysis patients and had room for 1 more. 2 weeks later, a card arrived at the courthouse. It was a plain card, white envelope, inside 2 signatures. Ruth's was in careful, old-fashioned cursive. Jade's was in the handwriting of someone who had taken time to write neatly rather than quickly. Ruth had written, "You gave my granddaughter something she needed, not the fine waved, the being seen. She hasn't stopped talking about it. Thank you, Judge." Jade had written, "I drive with Frank on Tuesdays while Grandma is in session. He's teaching me things my driver's ed instructor didn't cover. He says I'm a natural. I thought you should know that. Also, I'm going to be a lawyer. I decided. I am going to be a lawyer. I decided." I read that twice. Then I laughed, genuinely laughed, the way you laugh when something delights you so completely and so unexpectedly that there is no other possible response. Doris from the doorway said, "Good news?" I said, "The best kind." I think about Jade Whitfield often. I think about the notebook, about the timeline written in columns at 6 in the morning by a teenager who wanted to be able to explain herself fairly, about the paragraph that ended with, "I would choose it again." I think about what it means to be 16 years old and already understand the difference between an excuse and a reason. Already understand that if you are going to stand before someone and ask for fairness, you have to be able to demonstrate that you were fair in your own thinking first. My grandmother, who came to this country from a small town in eastern Kentucky with 4 children and $12, used to say that good character is not what you show people. It is what you do when no one is watching. And the proof of it, she said, is that you behave the same way whether anyone is watching or not. Jade Whitfield documented her thinking at 6 in the morning when no one was watching. Not because she knew she would end up in a courtroom, because she wanted to be honest with herself about the decision she was making. That is character, built quietly before there was any audience for it. I have practiced law and administered it for 40 years. I have read more statutes than I can count. I have studied precedent and procedure and the long, complex architecture of how justice is supposed to work. And I will tell you plainly, a spiral notebook from a drugstore, filled in at 6 in the morning by a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be fair to a judge she had not yet met, taught me something that none of that reading did. It reminded me that integrity is not a product of education or age or circumstance. It is a decision made again and again in the small moments before the big ones arrive. Jade made it at 6:34 in the morning on a Wednesday in March when she put the car in drive and said to herself, "I am doing something I can account for, and I will account for it." That is all any of us can do with a hard choice. Account for it and be willing to say so out loud. If this story reached something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me about a young person in your life who surprised you, who showed you something about character that you were not expecting. I read every single comment, every one. And if you know a young person who is carrying more than their share right now, a young person who is being quiet and responsible and strong and hoping someone will notice, share this with them. Let them know that people notice, that the weight is seen. That is sometimes all it takes to help someone keep going. God bless you, Jade. God bless you, Ruth. God bless Frank, the retired teacher on Tuesdays. And God bless all of you watching this, wherever you are. I will see you next week.